The summer sun blazed mercilessly over Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists crowded the iconic gates. Among them stood James Mitchell, a 28-year-old software engineer from Ohio, clutching his camera with sweaty palms. This was his first trip to London, and he had saved for 2 years to make this dream vacation happen. James had arrived at the palace gates at dawn, determined to capture the perfect photograph of the famous Queen's Guard. He had read countless travel blogs about these stoic soldiers who stood motionless for hours, their red tunics and tall black bearskin hats making them living symbols of British tradition. What fascinated James most were the stories of their unwavering discipline, how they never broke character, no matter what tourists did around them. The guard James focused on was Corporal William Davies, a 24-year-old from Wales who had served in the Welsh Guards for 3 years. Davies stood at his post outside the palace, his rifle held at the present arms position, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Behind his expressionless face, he was acutely aware of everything happening around him. The constant camera flashes, the chatter in dozens of languages, the occasional tourist who tried to make him laugh or flinch. Davies had been on guard duty since 6 a.m., and it was now approaching noon. The temperature had climbed to an uncomfortable 32 degrees Celsius, and sweat trickled down his back beneath the heavy wool tunic. His bearskin hat, weighing nearly 2 pounds, felt like a furnace on his head. Yet he remained perfectly still, as he had been trained to do. James positioned himself about 10 feet away from the guard, adjusting his camera settings for the perfect shot. He wanted to capture not just the guard's imposing presence, but the contrast between his stillness and the bustling crowd around him. As he knelt down to get a better angle, James noticed how the guard's face remained completely neutral despite the chaos surrounding him. A group of teenagers nearby were making silly faces and gestures, trying to get the guard's attention. An elderly couple from Germany asked their daughter to pose next to the soldier for a family photo. Children pointed and whispered, fascinated by this real-life toy soldier who never moved. Through it all, Corporal Davies remained statuesque, his breathing so controlled that his chest barely rose and fell. James spent nearly an hour photographing the guard from different angles. He was amazed by the man's dedication and discipline. In his corporate world back in Ohio, James struggled to sit still through hour-long meetings, yet here was someone who could stand motionless for hours in the blazing heat, wearing a heavy uniform, while hundreds of people gawked at him. As the crowd began to thicken with the lunchtime rush of tourists, James decided to move closer for one final perfect shot. He wanted to capture the intricate details of the guard's uniform, the polished buttons, the precise way his rifle was held, the immaculate condition of his boots despite standing on the same spot for hours. Little did James know that this decision would lead to an incident that would be talked about for years to come, shared across social media platforms, and become a perfect example of the unexpected humanity that can emerge from the most rigid traditions. The stage was set for a moment that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about duty, respect, and human kindness. James crept closer to the guard, his camera held high, trying to frame the perfect shot that would capture the ornate golden details of the uniform's braiding. The crowd had grown thicker, with tour groups pushing past each other, children running between legs, and vendors calling out prices for miniature Union Jack flags and royal family postcards. Behind James, a family from Australia was struggling with an oversized umbrella, trying to create shade for their elderly grandmother. The father, Mark Sullivan, wrestled with the mechanism while his wife held bottles of water and their 2 young children danced around impatiently in the heat. They had been walking since early morning, visiting Westminster Abbey and the Tower of London, before making their way to Buckingham Palace. As Mark finally managed to open the large beach umbrella, a sudden gust of wind caught it. The umbrella twisted in his hands like a wild animal, its bright blue and white stripes flapping violently. Mark fought to maintain control, but the wind was stronger than his grip. Tourists around them stepped back, sensing something was about to go wrong. "Honey, just let it go," his wife Sarah shouted over the noise of the crowd and the snapping fabric. But Mark, determined not to lose the expensive umbrella they had bought specifically for this trip, held on tighter. James, completely focused on adjusting his camera settings and oblivious to the drama unfolding behind him, took another step closer to Corporal Davies. He was now only about 5 feet away, close enough to see the tiny beads of sweat on the guard's forehead and the incredible precision with which his uniform had been pressed and prepared. The umbrella broke free from Mark's hands with a violent snap. It cartwheeled through the air, its metal spokes catching the sunlight like a spinning weapon. Several tourists screamed and ducked as it flew over their heads. The umbrella's trajectory was taking it directly toward the area where James and the guard stood. Corporal Davies saw the umbrella coming in his peripheral vision, but his training held him in place. Guards were taught to remain at their posts unless there was genuine danger to the royal family or palace security. A runaway umbrella, while potentially embarrassing, did not constitute such a threat. His eyes tracked its movement, calculating whether he needed to break protocol. James, still peering through his camera viewfinder, was completely unaware of the approaching projectile. He had just found the perfect angle to capture the guard's profile when the umbrella struck him squarely in the back. The impact sent him stumbling forward, his camera flying from his hands. In a desperate attempt to regain his balance, James reached out to steady himself. His hands found the first solid object available, which happened to be a large bottle of ice-cold water that another tourist had set down nearby. As James grabbed for it, the bottle slipped from his wet palms and arced through the air. Time seemed to slow down as the bottle spun end over end, water streaming from its open top like a silver ribbon in the sunlight. Every eye in the immediate area followed its path as it headed directly toward Corporal Davies, who still stood perfectly at attention, unable to move from his post. The ice-cold water hit the guard full in the face and chest, soaking through his thick red tunic and dripping from the fur of his bearskin hat. The crowd around them fell silent, the sudden quiet so complete that the only sound was water dripping onto the pavement. Even the children stopped their chatter, sensing that something significant had just happened. James lay on the ground where he had fallen, his camera beside him with a cracked screen. He looked up to see the guard standing there, completely drenched, water still running down his uniform and pooling at his feet. The American tourist's face turned pale as he realized what he had done. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. James remained sprawled on the ground, staring up at the soaking wet guard in horror. The hundreds of tourists around them stood frozen, their cameras and phones forgotten in their hands. Even the street vendors stopped hawking their souvenirs, sensing the weight of the moment. Corporal Davies felt the cold water seeping through every layer of his uniform. His wool tunic, designed to keep him warm during long hours of duty, now clung to his skin like a wet blanket. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his bearskin hat, running down his face and into his eyes. Behind his stoic expression, his mind was racing. This had never happened in his 3 years of guard duty. He had dealt with tourists trying to make him laugh, children attempting to climb on him, and even the occasional person who got too close and had to be warned away by other guards. But being completely drenched while on duty? This was uncharted territory. James slowly pushed himself up from the ground, his knees shaking. He had read about the strict protocols surrounding the Queen's Guard, how interfering with them could result in arrest or significant fines. Images flashed through his mind of being detained by palace security, of international incidents, of his photo appearing in newspapers back home under headlines about disrespectful American tourists. Oh God, I'm so sorry," James whispered, his voice barely audible. He took a tentative step toward the guard, then stopped, unsure if approaching would make things worse. Behind him, Mark Sullivan had finally retrieved his runaway umbrella and was watching the scene with growing guilt. Realizing his struggle with the umbrella had started this chain of events, the crowd began to murmur, phones appearing as people started recording what they expected to be either an arrest or a dramatic breakdown of military discipline. Some tourists backed away, not wanting to be associated with the incident. Others pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something that would be shared millions of times on social media. Davies could hear the whispers around him, could see the phones being raised to record whatever happened next. In his peripheral vision, he noticed other guards beginning to move, their own training kicking in as they assessed whether this situation required intervention. Protocol dictated that he should remain at his post, but protocol had never anticipated anything quite like this. Water continued to drip from his uniform, creating a small puddle around his highly polished boots. The ornate braiding on his tunic, which James had been so eager to photograph, was now darkened with moisture. His rifle, still held in the present arms position, had water droplets rolling down its barrel. James's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. Should he run? Should he stay and try to explain? Should he offer to help somehow? He glanced around desperately, looking for palace security or police, expecting them to appear at any moment to arrest him for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the distant noise of London traffic. A small child in the crowd started to cry, perhaps sensing the tension in the air. Her mother quickly picked her up and moved away from the scene, not wanting to be nearby when whatever was about to happen actually happened. Davies knew that every second he remained motionless while soaking wet was being recorded and would likely be analyzed later by his superiors. His commanding officers would want to know why he hadn't followed standard procedure, why he hadn't immediately called for assistance or taken some action to address the situation. But something else was happening in Corporal Davies's mind. As he stood there feeling the cool water against his overheated skin, he found himself thinking about the tourist who had caused this mess. The young man looked absolutely terrified, clearly devastated by what had happened. It was obvious that this had been a complete accident, the result of an unfortunate series of events rather than any malicious intent. The guard's training had prepared him for many things, but it hadn't prepared him for this moment of human connection. This opportunity to choose between rigid adherence to protocol and something else entirely. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change in Corporal Davies's expression. The rigid mask that had been maintained for hours started to soften. His eyes, which had been staring straight ahead according to protocol, shifted downward to look at the terrified tourist still struggling to get to his feet. James caught the guard's eye contact and felt his heart sink even further. He was certain that this direct acknowledgement meant he was about to be arrested, or at least severely reprimanded. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but no words came out. His throat felt dry despite having just witnessed someone get thoroughly soaked. What happened next would be talked about and shared across the internet for years to come. Instead of maintaining his rigid posture or calling for assistance, Corporal Davies did something completely unexpected. His lips began to twitch. At first it looked like he might be suppressing anger or frustration, but as the seconds passed it became clear that something else entirely was happening. The guard was trying not to smile. The absurdity of the situation had struck him all at once. Here he was, a trained soldier who had served in Afghanistan, who had marched in ceremonial parades before royalty and dignitaries, standing soaking wet because a tourist with a camera had been knocked over by a runaway beach umbrella. The ridiculous chain of events, the horror on the young man's face, the complete silence of hundreds of tourists waiting to see what would happen next. It was all suddenly, inexplicably funny. Davies lost the battle with his facial muscles. A small smile broke through first, then grew wider until it became an unmistakable grin. And then, in a moment that shattered every expectation of royal protocol, Corporal William Davies began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, barely audible over the ambient noise of the crowd. But as the humor of the situation fully hit him, the laughter grew stronger. Water was still dripping from his hat, his uniform was completely soaked, and he was laughing like someone who had just heard the funniest joke of his life. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps of amazement rippled through the tourists as they witnessed something they had never expected to see. A Queen's Guard breaking character not in anger or frustration, but in pure, genuine amusement. Phones that had been recording in anticipation of conflict now captured something much more extraordinary. James stared in disbelief. Instead of arrest or punishment, he was witnessing something that seemed impossible based on everything he had read about these famously stoic soldiers. The guard wasn't just smiling. He was actively laughing at the situation. Encouraged by the guard's unexpected response, James finally found his voice. "I am so sorry," he said, his American accent clear in the quiet that had fallen over the immediate area. "It was completely an accident. The umbrella hit me and I just—" Davies held up his free hand, the one not holding his rifle, in a gesture that clearly said, "No need to explain." Still grinning, he looked directly at James and spoke, his Welsh accent warm and friendly despite the formal setting. "Well," Davies said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, "that's certainly the most effective way anyone's tried to get my attention today." The crowd erupted. Laughter and applause broke out spontaneously as people realized they were witnessing not an international incident, but a moment of genuine human connection. The tension that had been building for the past few minutes evaporated instantly, replaced by joy and amazement. James felt tears of relief starting to form in his eyes. He had been certain his vacation was about to turn into a nightmare, involving lawyers and international complications. Instead, he had somehow become part of a moment that felt magical. But Corporal Davies wasn't finished surprising everyone. Still grinning and dripping wet, Corporal Davies looked around at the crowd of amazed tourists. The laughter and applause continued, but he could see that people were still uncertain about what was happening. This kind of interaction with a Queen's Guard was so far outside normal experience that many weren't sure how to react. Davies made another decision that would cement this moment in internet history. He carefully shifted his rifle to one hand, maintaining proper respect for his weapon, and reached up with his free hand to adjust his soaking bearskin hat. As he did so, a stream of water poured out of it like a small waterfall, splashing onto the ground at his feet. "Well," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "I suppose this is one way to cool off on a hot day." The crowd's laughter doubled in volume. Children who had been hiding behind their parents now came forward, pointing and giggling at the friendly soldier who was making jokes while standing in a puddle of his own making. Parents who had been worried about explaining military protocol to their young ones now found themselves witnessing a perfect example of grace under pressure. James, emboldened by the guard's continued good humor, took a step closer. "Is there anything I can do? I mean, you're completely soaked because of me. Can I don't know, get you a towel or something?" Davies's grin widened even further. "A towel? From where exactly? I'm rather stuck here until my relief arrives." He gestured to his post with a slight nod, though I have to say after 3 hours in this heat, that water was actually quite refreshing. Mark Sullivan, the Australian father whose umbrella had started the whole incident, finally worked up the courage to approach. His face was red with embarrassment and guilt. "Mate, I am so sorry. It was my umbrella that knocked him over. I should have just let the bloody thing go." Davies looked at Mark with the same friendly expression. "Ah, so you're the umbrella culprit. Well, I suppose we all played our part in this little drama." He looked between Mark and James. The umbrella thrower, the water bearer, and the very wet guard. Sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? By now, other guards at nearby posts were glancing over, clearly aware that something unusual was happening but unable to leave their own positions. Davies could see Sergeant Williams in the distance trying to assess the situation. He knew that his response to this incident would either be celebrated or result in a very uncomfortable conversation with his commanding officer later. A young girl, probably about 8 years old, broke free from her mother's hand and ran up to Davies. Before anyone could stop her, she reached into her small backpack and pulled out a packet of tissues. "Here, Mr. Guardman," she said in a clear voice that carried across the crowd. "My mommy always says you should help people when they're wet." The crowd fell completely silent again, watching to see how Davies would handle this innocent gesture from a child. He looked down at the little girl, his expression softening even further. Carefully maintaining his grip on his rifle, he bent slightly at the waist in a formal bow. "Thank you, miss," he said with complete seriousness. "That's very kind of you. However, I'm afraid I'm a bit too wet for just tissues to help. Perhaps you could keep those for someone who needs them more than I do?" The little girl nodded solemnly and ran back to her mother, who was beaming with pride at her daughter's kindness and the guard's gentle response. James watched this entire exchange with growing amazement. Not only had the guard responded to the accident with humor and grace, but he was now handling each interaction with the crowd with perfect balance of friendliness and respect for his position. As if reading James's thoughts, Davies turned back to him. "You know, in 3 years of doing this job, I've had people try everything to get a reaction from me. But I have to say, no one's ever tried the full water bucket treatment. Points for originality." The crowd laughed again, but now there was something different in the air. What had started as an embarrassing accident had transformed into something special. A moment where rigid protocol had given way to human kindness, where a simple act of understanding had turned a potential disaster into a celebration of grace and humor. As the crowd continued to buzz with excitement and amazement, Corporal Davies realized that his break from protocol, while spontaneous and genuine, needed to come to an end. He could see Sergeant Williams making his way through the tourists, and he knew that his commanding officer would need to assess the situation professionally. But before returning to his formal duties, Davies had one final surprise for everyone present. He looked directly at James, who was still standing nearby with his cracked camera, clearly still processing the incredible turn of events. "You mentioned you were trying to get a photograph," Davies said. "I'm afraid I've rather ruined your shot, haven't I?" James nodded, holding up his damaged camera. "It's okay, honestly. After what just happened, a broken camera is the least of my worries. I was just so scared that I'd gotten you in trouble or—" Davies interrupted him with a raised hand. "Tell you what," he said, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "I can't move from this spot, but there's no rule against people taking pictures of a very wet guard who's learned something new about staying cool in the summer heat." The crowd immediately understood what he was offering. Dozens of phones and cameras appeared as tourists realized they were being invited to document this extraordinary moment. But Davies wasn't finished with his surprises. Looking at James specifically, he said, "And you, young man with the water-throwing skills, why don't you get that picture you were after? I promise to stand very still this time, though I can't guarantee I'll be dry." James looked down at his broken camera, then back at the guard with confusion. Davies noticed his predicament and turned to address the crowd. "Does anyone have a camera they could lend to our American friend here? After all, he's traveled quite a distance to get a photo with one of us, even if he had to soak me first to make it memorable." Immediately, several tourists stepped forward offering their cameras and phones. An elderly British gentleman pressed his expensive camera into James's hands. "Go on, lad," he said with a warm smile. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime shot." As James approached with the borrowed camera, Davies straightened his posture back into the formal guard position. Though water was still dripping from his uniform and a genuine smile remained on his face. "Right then," he said. "Let's get you that photo. And this time, try to keep all liquids at a safe distance." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause as James carefully positioned himself for the shot. What he captured through the viewfinder was extraordinary. A completely professional Queen's Guard standing at perfect attention, but with water still dripping from his uniform and an unmistakable twinkle of humor in his eyes. Click. The photo was taken, but it captured so much more than just an image. As James lowered the camera, Davies spoke one final time to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this rather unusual break in our regular programming, but I'm afraid it's time for me to return to being a proper, stoic, and hopefully dry guard." He straightened his shoulders and resumed his official stance, but as he did so, he gave James a quick, almost imperceptible wink. Sergeant Williams arrived just as Davies was settling back into his formal posture. He looked at the wet uniform, the puddle on the ground, and the excited crowd of tourists all still recording and taking pictures. After a moment of assessment, the sergeant simply nodded to Davies and began gently dispersing the crowd. As people began to move away, sharing excited conversations about what they had just witnessed, James approached Davies one last time. The guard was back in full formal mode, staring straight ahead, but James knew he could hear him. "Thank you," James said quietly. "Not just for not having me arrested, but for showing me what real grace looks like." Though Davies couldn't respond while back in his official capacity, James could have sworn he saw the slightest hint of a smile return to the guard's face. Within hours, videos and photos of the incident were spreading across social media platforms worldwide. The story of the tourist who accidentally soaked a Queen's Guard, and the guard's amazingly gracious response, became a symbol of kindness overcoming awkwardness, of humanity prevailing over rigid protocol. James returned home to Ohio with more than just a great story and an unforgettable photo. He had witnessed something that restored his faith in human nature, the power of choosing grace and humor over anger and punishment. And somewhere in Wales, Corporal William Davies had learned that sometimes the most memorable moments come not from following the rules perfectly, but from knowing when humanity matters more than protocol. The incident became legendary among the Queen's Guard, a reminder that while their duty is serious, their humanity is what makes them truly remarkable. And every time the temperature soared during summer duty, guards would jokingly ask each other if they needed someone to bring them a cooling bucket of water. Though none ever volunteered for quite such a dramatic delivery method again.